Good day, everybody. Welcome to the activity group webinar from Dragos. And I'm excited to have you here today, and thanks for your time. Let's see, we're gonna talk about some fun things today, maybe pop some bubbles out there and really get into the idea of what is an activity group and what it's supposed to be, what are some of the issues that people have with it, and what are we going to do with what do we get, basically the idea is what should you do with an activity group? How's it useful to defenders? And also some versus, how do people use it maybe irresponsibly? And maybe talk through some of those as well, where it may harm you if you don't use them correctly. So I'm your host, Sergio Caltagirone, and I joined with my co-host, Joe Slowik. Hey, Joe, how you doing?
Doing very well. Happy to be on here. So Joe Slowik coming from the Sans CTI Summit right now, actually, on the heels of Dragos' presence at the S4 conference in Miami.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we've been super busy with our S4 conference, and then our the big ICS detection challenge. We have a new platform. A new version of our platform launching. So there's been a bit of a what can we pull together, because honestly we've been completely slammed, but that's good. ICS is hard, but it's obviously very, very important. And so I'm Sergio Caltagirone, and Joe Slowik is joining me, and today we're going to talk about activity groups. So what I first want to mention is that right there at the front of your screen is the diamondmodel.org. So that's a URL you can go to get resources on the diamond model, and we'll talk about why the diamond model is important in this. But it's the foundational document for the idea of activity groups and how you create them and what they're created for. So we will reference that quite a bit. And so anyway, if you want to find out more about it, then just go to that link. Okay, so let's start off. So basically, if you look on our website, you'll see a whole listing of activity groups there, right? It's our encyclopedia of activity groups. And of course, being a security vendor, you got to give them really cool names. And so we chose rare earth elements. Like I tell you, in my threat intel career, probably one of the hardest jobs I've had is to choose a naming convention for threats. It seems silly, but when you get down to, what you can do, what's copyrighted, what's trademarked, what is not, either culturally sensitive. You can't use the names of, gods or anything like that, publicly without, offending certain groups. And so you have to be very careful about how you name things. And then, of course, your name set has to be big enough and all that. We'll talk about, naming a little bit later, but we chose a fairly benign name set, which is rare earth minerals. And so it's a good enough name set. Hopefully we'll never exceed the number that there is. If there is, we have much bigger problems than the naming scheme. And so we're gonna step through these, but first thing I want to talk about when we get to them isn't just an activity group. Aren't these names just the names for an adversary? So next slide, please. So the challenge here is absolutely not. These are not just fancy names for adversaries. And of course, we could use the word fancy because, of course, many of us have heard of like Fancy Bear and the names that are thrown out there. And then, of course, others, use numbers. FireEye, of course, using APT numbers, or and then Eyesight, obviously, before then, use a different naming scheme. And so we'll kind of go through all those, but the answer is no. An activity group is not a fancy name for an adversary. And my hope is that one of the things you come away from this with is a better idea that an activity group is much bigger than that, and people use it for different things. So just because you see a name out there, and even if you see the name associated, so say somebody says, oh, this is this country, and Dragos says it's Zenitime, Dragos calls it Zenitime. That doesn't mean that Dragos or whoever else is being included in those lists, whether it's on Twitter or in a news article or what have you. It doesn't mean that these are necessarily equivalents, and that's really important to realize. And so in our language, whenever we're talking about activity groups, try to be very careful with that. And we use the term overlap or associations to and things like that, noting that there are linkages between groups, between different companies and between different names, but those linkages are not necessarily equivalencies, and that's really important. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So first off, I want to just break the bubble of a fancy name here is not just a name for an adversary. Because honestly, if I was really doing that, I would just come out and call it the name. I don't need a cool name to do that. You know, we're not in a place where, you know, I need cover terms to, you know, cover my butt because, you know, certain things, right? If I'm going to call an adversary, you know, who they are, then I'm just going to come out and say it. I don't need a fancy name to do that. So, but we do use these names for a reason. Okay, so next. So fundamentally, we need to get to what the idea of a diamond event is. And so this is how everything kind of comes together in intrusion analysis, right? So again, going back to diamondmodels.org if you want to see the paper and all the material about these. But fundamentally, right, we have 4 features of a diamond model or a diamond event. I'm sorry, we have you know, some sort of adversary taking a step towards an intended goal by using a capability over infrastructure against the victim. And so fundamentally what we say is that every malicious intrusion activity has these 4 components. There's an adversary and there's a victim, clearly. There's a piece of infrastructure and there's a capability. And now you can, and I'm not going to go too deep into the diamond model here. There's, you know, other areas that we need to cover. But what I want to say is that really fundamentally what we're talking about when we talk about activity groups is we're talking about the relationships between various events. So if one event is Mimikatz, you know, being delivered through DNS text records, you know, onto a victim network from an adversary we don't know, and then, you know, maybe another event in a year from now is Mimikatz being delivered against, you know, another victim against across maybe DNS the same way, but maybe again, you know, from other infrastructure. Well, from a diamond model perspective, those 2 things have similarities, right? There's in both of those cases, there's Mimikatz being delivered over DNS text records. Now that, you know, and you can say, well, that's not super common. That's not the traditional, you know, that's not the most common way of delivering Mimikatz and things like this. You know, even though Mimikatz is you know, openly available, you can say, well, doing it this way is different. So maybe that's, you know, we're going to say that this type of methodology attached to this type of capability in this infrastructure is going to be what is going to set this activity group apart. And so again, here it is, we don't know who the adversary is, but we've got these linkages here between one event and another event that we're going to say are somehow tied together. Now, as an analyst, I can completely say, those 2 things shouldn't be tied together, and I will not tie them together. And that's a legitimate answer as well. Realize that when you look at activity groups, at the results of intelligence analysis, when you read news reports and you read intelligence reports, you're reading a whole bunch of choices and biases that the analyst is making. And some of those are going to be good, right? Some of those you don't necessarily want as a consumer of intelligence or user of intelligence. You don't have to necessarily want to have to redo all of somebody else's work, right? That's not what it's good. That's not good. But at the same time, you need to realize that, well, analysts can also throw off the boat data that might, you know, contradict that group. And they may choose to disregard contradictory evidence. That's very common now. In fact, one of the most common analyst biases. So in that case, maybe there was other data that you didn't know about that the analyst chose not to include. That's important to realize. And so how all of these get to put together is ultimately up to the analyst in their mind. And so that's, you know, fundamentally you need to understand that what you're reading is the outcome of a mental process. Next. So when you put these together, you create an activity group, right? So these are sets of diamond events that are associated by similarity, and they're weighted by confidence. So again, I can say that, hey, yes, Mimikatz ties these 2 things together, but Mimikatz alone is a low confidence association. Why? Because, you know, lots of things could use Mimikatz, right? Now, the other question is, well, maybe the purpose of my activity group is to track all the ways that Mimikatz is being delivered. Well, then Mimikatz becomes the strongest association and everything else becomes weaker. Again, that's very important to realize that fundamentally an activity group answers an analytic question. What am I trying to answer? Most of the time when you're in the news and you see these names like Fancy Bear or AP228 or what have you, these are analysts that are tying capabilities and infrastructure together for the purpose of answering the question of who did it. What is the common adversary behind this activity? And linking things together based on that analytic question. But that's not the only analytic question that exists. In fact, analysts very regularly and a lot of times subconsciously create questions in their mind and group activity together. And some of these come out in the analysis without you recognizing them. So again, just using the Mimikatz example, we can say that, you know, for one analytic question, which is, I'm going to tie activity together, which is likely being produced by the same adversary. Mimikatz itself is probably not a very strongly weighted association, again, because it's common and it's openly available. Anyone could do it, right? So we don't want to necessarily make that the key linkage. But hey, Mimikatz being delivered over DNS text records, well, that's unique. And so we're going to make that the core linkage. Now, we definitely want to use Mimikatz as one of the features that we're linking together, but that's going to be a low confidence weighted linkage versus the DNS text records methodology. So again, those are how you do that. And the whole purpose of this fundamentally is to come up with a mitigation strategy that brings and that delivers broader effects than attacking a single piece of activity. So, you know, generally the idea is that when you do network defense, and the idea here is the money you put into it, the time you put into it, and things like that, you tend not to want to attack one thing at a time. You tend to want to take actions that are going to have broad effects. That will potentially, you know, if I could spend $1 million and I could solve, you know, 50 security questions, you know, why am I going to spend, you know, $500,000 10 times to solve 10 individual questions? You know, and just end up causing me more time and money that way. So, and this is why we group a lot of things, right? Physicists group things by, say, you know, astrophysicists group things in, you know, by types of galaxies. Obviously, we group things in, you know, in geology by how things were made, by the time frame that things were made in. These are, you know, throughout science and anywhere that human understanding comes into play, we tend to group like things together. And so this is a traditional human cognitive behavior. And it's important to realize that what I'm defining here is nothing new. We're just trying to put words around it so that we better understand it. And the idea is that we tend to create these groupings because we can't keep individual things in our mind that easily. I can't keep 1,000 events individually in my mind. Now, I might be able to reference 1,000 events, but you know, those will have to be triggered, you know, using some other mnemonic kind of approach. But you know, holding that all together in my short-term memory or working memory is not going to be feasible. So we create groups of things to make better effect, you know, to make more effectiveness of our memory. So again, the idea here is when we're making security decisions, activity groups are very valuable because we can lump like activity together, whatever that definition of like is. And now we're going to get into kind of some of the more nitty-gritties of that. So next. So what do you normally see? So normally, most people, most users of intelligence, whether you're reading a news article, reading a report or something like that, you will traditionally see activity groups being formed to identify a common adversary. And these are usually similarities in what I call indirect. This is what I call indirect attribution, meaning they are, this is not first-hand attribution, right? Meaning there are certain types of attribution where you can catch somebody doing something. It's called, you know, quote unquote, the smoking gun, right? Where you might have the recording of them from the security camera actually hacking into something. And you would actually see that. You'd see the key, you'd see the individual, you'd see the keyboard typing, you'd see the effects on their screen as well as on the victim screen, right? That's what we would call a first order attribution, direct attribution. Now, of course, that type of attribution is limited, and sometimes we get it in the cybercrime space. In other times, you know, that will be limited to, say, national intelligence apparatus and the visibility that they might have into certain facilities and groups and individuals. So generally, what we call true attribution or direct or first order attribution is generally not available to private individuals or security companies. Generally, what we see is when it comes to these things, we see secondary, tertiary attribution, and what I like to say is indirect attribution. So that is where you're linking things together and there's something that ties it to some persona, right? Maybe it's a person's name or a handle or an email address or whatever you got. And then, you know, somebody does some, you know, OSINT and Google searching and some, you know, LinkedIn searching and ends up finding somebody with the same name who works in some sort of cyber division, and they're like, oh, look, it's the same person. And then at that point, you're now many hops, right, to that conclusion. And so you got to be very, very careful of that, again, because what the analysts did was link all of this technical activity together and then basically induce through several leaps of logic to a person, individual, group, country, you know, anything like that. And so that's a really hard thing to do. And again, like I see, most of the time when you see people talking about this, it's mostly because they're honestly, it's intelligent guessing. They don't actually have evidence of the attribution from what we would traditionally call evidence. It's actually just, you know, several orders of indirect association. And so, but again, the idea here is to get you to the idea that activity groups are so much bigger than that, right? We can talk about activity groups and looking at terms of things like, let's type, you know, what type of attribution do we maybe need? You know, maybe I'm looking for other attribution I've done in my career is I've linked pieces of malware together based on potentially the same authorship. I don't care who the author is. I just care about these are, you know, these potential pieces of malware were written by the same individual, or maybe the same, or maybe these individuals contributed components to the malware. That's an activity group. Again, things I'm linking together analytically to answer a question. The other thing that's important to realize is activity groups are not static. As adversaries change, so does the activity group change. So sometimes activity groups need to change. They need to absorb new activity they may have not necessarily defined before. Our questions may have changed. So maybe the way we link stuff together may not be as effective any longer. So we have to basically do that. And sometimes these things just go away. I mean, I've gained and lost activity groups in my career like nobody's business, right? So, and that's really important to realize is sometimes you got to realize when to give up. And a lot of people, that's very hard. Activity groups become very personal. They've named them. It's like their baby. They may have, you know, ridden this activity group for 5 years, and they did 10,000 con presentations off of this, and you know they got their name all over all these blogs, and that's who they're known for. And then all of a sudden, their activity group is gone, right? I've seen so many people now fight tooth and nail to label some new activity part of their group because of some, you know, association. Well, that's fine. But just realize that with names, you know, when it comes to naming things, there's some inherent power that comes along with that. And I'm not, you know, I'm not saying this jokingly, right? It's a real cognitive dissonance with analysts. And so sometimes just realize groups go away and we may not know why. And that's okay. That's just the way it goes. And sometimes we have to change the definition of the group because we get it wrong. That's okay too. Part of analysis is also recognizing when you get it wrong and fixing it. And so just realize that what you call something, just realize that that's not static. Just because it's APT 28 in the news doesn't mean that APT 28 hasn't changed in its lifetime, right? I mean, it's changed a whole bunch. In fact, what APT 28 looks like now looks remarkably dissimilar to what it looked like 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? Significantly. In fact, you would say those two activities are pretty much not the same. It's just this over 7+ years of linking activity together to get to where we are. So those are all very important things to realize with activity groups, right? That, you know, that all these things, and then now realize also that evidence chain may have broken, right? Sometimes somebody made a really spurious link that was not accurate, and all of a sudden links, you know, kept linking into the future. Now it could be that if you're grouping for attribution, maybe your original attribution was correct. But because of some spurious link that you made, now all this future attribution is false. All this future activity is actually now false. It's not associated at all, right? And I can tell you as a nation state adversary at one point in my career, that was hilarious, right? To see that happen. You know, because you're like, boy, these analysts think they know what the hell they're doing. And you're like, oh, well, not super well. So that's, you know, there's a little bit of schadenfreude also on the adversary side when this happens. And it's again, because sometimes it's just analysis is hard. It's not a perfect, it's not a science. It's not a perfect, it's not perfected. So next. So how do you go about, like, and what are types of analytic problems? And I already talked about some of them, right? So here's a few more, right? Intent deduction. This is something that a lot of people use. Why did they do this? And so you would tie a whole bunch of stuff together, you would group it together, and you say, okay, well, what does this lead us to think that's going on? As an analyst, these are important things, right? We get hired not to tell you what happened, to tell you why it's important. And so, you know, my job is to analyze technical data and then tell you it's important. Trending, right? That's also really important, right? How are things changed over time? That's another reason you would group like things together to track changes. Adversary capabilities and infrastructure. Hey, for tactical network defense, what are all of the MD5 hashes and IP addresses? This is the question I get asked all the time, that are associated with xenotime, right? And I just, you know, I use my grouping and say, well, here's everything that's linked together that we call xenotime, and here's the complete set of things for it. So again, these are, like I said, a lot of different ways of doing things. And we can go into, you know, like I said, I recommend going and reading the Diamond Model paper, because it would go into feature vectors and mathematically why things link together and when things are distinct enough. Because maybe something is distinct enough that it's like, this maybe shouldn't go in here, but it's got some, you know, it's using the same IP in malware, but maybe it's something actually different. You know, we have that, we have sometimes called party boxes, right? On the internet, where there are multiple adversaries operating in the same infrastructure, and they may even know or not know that each other are there. And those are cases where, again, you have analytic grouping problems, where if you use that, say, IP address to get, you know, with other things, and IP address becomes an important, you know, grouping feature, then all of a sudden you're going to not group very well. So it depends, again, depending. Maybe one of your problems is, hey, I want to see all the badness coming out of AWS. Right? Well, then group by AWS. And now, you know, you have a whole group of, here's all the badness we see out of AWS, right? Again, so these are different ways you can group. Next. So creating an activity group, right? So this is kind of like the activity group life cycle, the process, right? So first thing is you got to figure out, why am I grouping something? And sometimes analysts, when they start grouping things, they don't actually answer this question consciously. It's an unconscious process of just linking things together that look similar. But then the next step, it becomes much more conscious about what features are you going to select to group on, right? So maybe it's going to be the IP address and the file hash. Again, it's two features you can select, and then if those two things match, or maybe it's like, hey, within the same class C network, and this is MD5 hash, then I'm going to call these the same, right? And so then I classify events and I cluster them together. And this is very traditional classification and clustering theory. Then we create groups, right? So we say, hey, out of all these bad things that are going on, which of them match which of them match these features? And those go into a group, and then we can separate other groups and so forth. And then, of course, as we find out new things, they flow in, and we're like, hey, well, that's actually, you know, that's actually a group of xenotime over here. So that's a new xenotime thing. Awesome, let's call that xenotime. And let's put that name on the top of our report and talk about all this. And that's how things grow, right? And they change over time. And then once in a while, we have to analyze these groups and say, well, what do we know now about this? And then the last thing is redefine them, right? So from time to time, we may get things wrong. We might have to throw things off the raft, and we're like, hey, well, we thought this was xenotime, but now we have new information, and that wasn't xenotime. So maybe that actually belongs in a new group. Now we got to redefine what xenotime means, or at least to recheck it to make sure that didn't cause any pollution inside of our activity group. Okay, next. So mathematically, it kind of looks like this, right? There's a big set of events, and then there's some sort of function that says, hey, does this event match? What activity group does it match into? And then basically from, you know, this is all mentally done, right? This is, again, classic classification and clustering. And then basically you just drop them into groups, and then eventually you have this big set of groups, right? And that's what our, you know, what we call an encyclopedia. Some people call it the Rosetta Stone or whatever, right? It's just a grouping of things that you grouped, a group of groups. So next. And of course, what you end up with, right, from ours, so that whole process takes place, and what you end up with is this. And you're like, hey, Alanite, well, this activity we're going to link together, and we're going to say that it's got it's got certain types of PowerShell scripts. It's going to use Hydra. It's going to use PSExec, and you know, grouping all of this together, we're going to say that, you know, what we one of the questions we ask of the group is, hey, what are the victim sets that this group tends to focus? And And so for us, after looking at the data, and again, after we classify everything, then we get to that question and we're like, okay, well, what victims? And we classify those again into countries of origin, or countries of operation, and sectors. So here it's electric sector in US and UK. Again, so that's how you use activity groups. And then of course you would see it if we don't do a lot of public reporting, or very, very little. So at that point, privately from our intel service, you'd see us, talk about how Allanite is currently this. And then of course, if we bring in a new event, but it's against maybe the manufacturing sector, then of course we issue new intelligence that says, hey, Allanite may have shifted, right, to include, or maybe we're like, maybe they're not targeting the electric sector anymore. Maybe we don't see that any longer. Maybe it's been a year or more, and we age that intelligence off basically and say, we're going to change the definition of this group. It doesn't include electric sector anymore, right? We think that something's happened. So this is our choice, right? We can either say, well, let's redefine Allanite, or what we can do is we can either redefine it, or we could create a new group entirely. And again, this is up to really us as analysts to say what seems to be the best for the consumer of the intel, what would make most sense to them based on how we know that they're using the intelligence. And again, you end up with this big list of things. Next. So again, APT names everywhere, right? And so I also developed the APT analysis component and naming scheme over at Microsoft. So you see that we use the periodic table of the elements over there, and that tends to work pretty well. And then of course you've got things like Fancy Bear, and then you have Dell, which is like threat group 3390, and then you've got APT 29, all these different things, right? And it becomes a war of names, but just realize that this is really, really important to realize that all of these things have importance and significance. Next. So what it feels like is you are inundated, right, with names. That you can't keep them all straight. Everyone's got a spreadsheet of spreadsheets, and there's spreadsheets floating around, and everyone's like, well, I just need to know what your name is and all this. And I'm like, well, it doesn't work that way, right? So next. So what if I told you that these are not about names, right? That maybe, what I've led you up to here from all of this until now is really the idea that this is not about a name, right? That this is fundamentally about correlating activity consistently. And I like to say it's hard enough to correlate activity within a 10-person team, let alone a variety across organizations. So for instance, within our team at Dragos, right, it's like, well, we always have conversations and arguments over whether something has, this name or that name or, whatever, or it fits into this group or that group because of some nuances in our definition. And maybe sometimes we just don't classify something. We wait for more information to come out. And then we classify it later. That's actually probably the most reasonable solution to that problem when you get that opportunity. And then later you might then tell everyone, oh, well, that thing we talked about before, that's actually part of this group now. We're going to call it part of this group. Honestly, that's hard enough. That's so hard because it's hard enough within one team to do that, let alone if I had to now basically deconflict over 10 different companies out there naming everything. And that sucks because fundamentally, right, they're not going to really tell me everything. I'm not going to tell them everything and all of this, right? We're going to play these secret squirrel games. And we're never going to come to the same, you get 100 people in the room, right? You probably get close to 200, 300 people to actually do this, right? Because of all of the experts and expertise you'd have to bring in and stuff to do this effectively. Go ahead and tell me what solution has ever been solved by 300 people in a room. It really doesn't, these things are really hard. And that's not a great way of making analytic decisions. So that's not going to happen, right? And the answer is that these are really complex correlation and classification issues. And it's not about sharing names. It's actually about sharing a grouping function and a feature vector, right? That's actually what it's about. It has nothing to do with the name itself. Because honestly, if semantic has a name for something, say leaf miner, right? And they're classifying stuff into leaf miner, and we've only seen some of that issue. But then of course we even come out with Raspite, and we're like, well, these two things have a correlation, right? There's some correlation between these two groups. Well, that's interesting, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that Raspite and leaf miner are exactly the same, because honestly, Symantec may have a very different definition of what leaf miner is compared to us, and that just certain things seem to have crossed over. So I think that it is I think that's a real big problem, and that's one that a lot of people are, I would say, complain about legitimately, right? This is not easy for people who are trying to consume this. So I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to cop out of the problem. The problem exists. What I'm trying to say is the answer is not the one everybody says, is why can't you just all agree on one name, or hey, if you just shared names, it would work out so well, because that's actually not possible either. So it is a real problem, but what seems like simple solutions to it really don't address what is actually fundamentally going on with the grouping and the naming. Next. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Joe, who's going to talk about a few of our activity groups in detail.
Thank you, Sergio. So we've talked a lot at a theoretical level for how this process works and why one would go for this activity-based, behavior-centric method for grouping, well, defining an activity group. What does that look like in practice, and how do we relate that to some things that we've actually seen specifically within the industrial control system security space? So as I'm sure many people in the audience are aware, but just for background, since mid-2017, multiple reports have come out in both the news as well as from national level certs such as US CERT and the UK's NCSC on Russian-linked, not our statement, but the statement of the US government, intrusions or at least probing into electric utilities in the US, the United Kingdom, possibly Ireland, and possibly Germany as well. Looking at these cases, it seems like a monolithic sort of activity that would all relate to the same entity, and therefore, from a traditional naming schema, this is some single responsible party. Next slide, please. And initially, that's how this was treated within industry, roughly concurrent with when this activity first emerged from government sources. Symantec released a report that linked some of this activity, sort of precursors to some of the electric utility targeting, to a legacy adversary called Dragonfly. Dragonfly was responsible for the Havocs intrusions in the early 2010s, 2012 and 2014. And based on Symantec's analysis, they related this activity to the initial electric grid intrusion events, as well as some other items involving the oil and gas sector. Yet what was interesting about this, and going to Sergio's points of both how much can you see of an event and what sort of items are relevant and how different sort of activities may align in some respects but not in others, that while there were some points of commonality, a tool overlap and some infrastructure items, really once you started digging into the technical details of what was going on, we saw not just a distinction between Dragonfly and the new activity, but within the electric utility targeting, there were distinctions that made it appear quite distinct between different types of behaviors that are indicative of, at the very least, two different operational teams involved that sort themselves into separate groups of activity. Next slide, please. So if we want to look at this over time, we've had the chart previously showing some of the groups that we're currently tracking, Dymaloy and Allanite, which Sergio described in a little bit of detail earlier, that when we start looking into both what are the victims in question for how these attacks played out, what were the infection vectors that were utilized in order to get into target networks, what sort of tools were used, as well as, since this is an ICS specific series of cases, what were the intentions behind, or the goals and ICS impact within these events, that these really start to look like, potentially related. This may all ultimately relate to some single authority at the end, but distinct enough from a behavioral perspective that they align to different groups of activities. So, for example, Legacy Dragonfly really focused on manufacturing operations in Europe and North America, whereas Dymaloy and Allanite are focused on exclusively electric utility operations in Allanite's case, whereas Dymaloy is a blend of the two. In terms of infection vectors, there are some similarities in terms of the use of watering holes and fishing, but everyone uses fishing, so is that really a strong indicator? But also significant distinctions in how these campaigns were deployed. So Dragonfly using exploits and Trojanized software, whereas Dymaloy and Allanite really focused on credential harvesting in order to gain initial access to networks. And then from a persistence and malware level, there were certainly some overlaps. One item, for example, that links Dragonfly to Dymaloy, not shown on this table, but important to note, is a specific malware backdoor called Heraplor, which has only ever been identified in association with Dragonfly-linked activity. But it also shows up in Dymaloy activity as well. But not just that. There are other items in question. And not only that, but the only one of these entities that was capable of, or at least has demonstrated the use of, a industrial control specific tool set was Dragonfly. So this may seem esoteric or pedantic to a really detrimental degree. Why bother going into this fine detail in order to separate out what seem to be superficially related items? From a defensive standpoint and from a response standpoint as well, how these behave and how you would counteract them or look for them differs somewhat, especially in terms of targeting. For example, Dymaloy has manifested itself in both manufacturing and oil and gas and electric utility operations, whereas Allanite has only been focused on electric utility operations to date. So that alone, if you're prioritizing resources, provides a useful departure point for, okay, if depending on what my organization is involved, both its mission and its geography, which of these is more of a priority for me to worry about? Certainly, I want to have coverage on all of these because the fundamental tactics, techniques, and procedures which they use could be reused by other entities. But because I'm pretty sure that no one who is listening right now has an unlimited security budget with infinite time to use it, that we need to make choices and we need to prioritize with what's available to us. And so given that, this technique allows us to really refine how it is we want to respond to items and what sort of activities are most relevant to our operations. So next slide, please. So from that, we see that there are X number, in the case of Dragos, 8 specific activities that we're presently tracking. And some of these, we've talked about the Respite and Leaf Miner relationship previously, but Electrum, for example, which was involved in the crash override event in Ukraine, December 2016, if you look at some other reporting from other researchers, that you'll see like, oh, this is linked to sandworm activity, which is responsible for multiple black energy events in the 2015 Ukraine attack. Yet in digging into them, while there are similarities in how those entities behaved, and certainly in terms of targeting and victimology, but in digging into how the attack played out, there were significant differences both in what capabilities were deployed, the specific technical methodology through which the entity migrated through the network, and as a result, simply calling something sandworm yet again, despite the familiarity in the term and what the targeting was in question, really doesn't do much good, because fundamentally they behave quite differently, and there's distinctions to be drawn in how that activity represents itself in reality. Thus, even though it may seem petty to have a separate name for something that seems quite related, at the same time, from a detection, tracking, and defense standpoint, it's really talking about maybe not completely separate, but certainly on very fundamental levels, distinct enough so that one would respond differently in each case. Next slide, please. So handing it back to Sergio to close out with some final points.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Let's see. So I think the fact is that activity groups are an analytic concept driven by an analysis problem. And honestly, one thing that you've got to be very careful of as a consumer, an external consumer of intelligence, is asking the question, are the analysts grouping for a problem that you're trying to solve? Is their problem the same as your problem? Because if you're relying on their grouping, and they're grouping for a different purpose fundamentally, then the conclusions of the analysis may not fit you very well. And that's a really big problem. Another one is that realizing that there's various degrees of confidence in this, and that as groups get larger, the confidence actually tends to get weaker, that everything is necessarily correlated. So here you have another problem, right, which is groups that last a long time and include lots and lots and lots and lots of activity actually tend to have significantly more a much higher error rate than otherwise. And so you got to be very careful about these gigantic groups, right? I mean, we joke on Twitter all the time that now everything is APT 28 because it's grown so large, so big, so long that it tends to now we have an overclassification problem, right? Where everything, we're overfitting our, overfitting our model. So there, the problem is, right, everything tends to look like it. And now the problem is now maybe that doesn't have any value, right? What we call it is may not do as well from a security operations perspective. Activity groups are not equivalent to attribution, but they can be used that way. So just because you see names doesn't mean that that's what the analyst is doing. In fact, at Dragos, we don't do that specifically. We don't have the visibility necessary, right? In my life, I have done true first-party attribution. And I can tell you that the data that almost everybody on the private sector has, you're not anywhere near it, right? To the point where I feel comfortable at all to be making those types of leaps, where it's going to be plastered on the New York Times and say, this country is responsible for this. Like, that's not cool because of some leaps of faith that you're taking. And I consider that to be, generally fairly poor practice to do things like that. If you don't have direct evidence of it. The next thing is that activity groups are useful for analysts and defenders, and it's really good because these groups tend to allow us to take broader implications and take more strategic action, because now we can take an action against a whole group of activity or multiple groups of activity. A really important thing to say is, hey, if I take this one defensive action, if I make this one policy change, I can actually affect 12 different activity groups and how they operate. That's really powerful because now you can improve or significantly increase the ROI of your defensive operations. And then the last thing is, of course, activity groups use stupid names. They always will, and that's just the way of it. And so the question is, are we going, and there was a question here, are we going to work with other security companies on standardizing naming conventions? The answer is no. I have worked now doing this for almost 20 years. I have worked on attempts to bring naming convention together. And I can tell you that it's just not reasonable or possible, nor is it worth anybody's real time. Because as soon as you do, I can tell you, because I have created cooperative naming conventions before, and I can tell you it breaks almost immediately. And so it is a nightmare, and it's not really worth the effort. Again, if you're using names the way that you should be as a defender, then you shouldn't have a problem with other people's names. The problem is that right now a lot of people are misusing names to think that they are equivalencies, or they're drawing conclusions from it that they may not be able to, given the confidence in that. And I think that's one of the fundamental issues. There's just too much power given to names. So next. And so that's that. And so we'll take a few questions. I appreciate everyone's time. I'm Sergio. With me is Joe. You can see our Twitter handles there. You can reach us at intel@dragos.com anytime. And of course, we love to answer questions. So if you have any, don't hesitate to drop us a line. If you want more information on the Diamond model and how all of this works together, go to diamondmodel.org. Yeah, we're really excited. Dragos is obviously, you know, we get to have fun, and our plan is we try to do it right. Even though it may not be the, you know, most, it may not be the easiest way to do it. Our goal is always to try to do it right. So let's take a few questions from the audience.